Good evening. I'm attorney Lawrence Berliner. I'm an attorney in the field of special education law. Our co-host this evening is Jane Faherty, who is the director of the JumpStart program, also an advocate. And we have two special guests, our returning champions, Marla and Allie Grafman, who are advocates. Each will introduce themselves. As you'll see, there's a disclaimer up on the screen. I am licensed to practice here in Connecticut. I know we've had people from other countries and other states, but all of our information, the four of us, is based on Connecticut law. The information here is for general information purposes. It doesn't establish an attorney-client relationship with myself, Lawrence Berliner, or the three advocates. Zoom is a third-party provider. This was being recorded, and Zoom is not an agent of myself, the law office of Lawrence Berliner, LLC, the Stamford Jewish Community Center, or the advocates as well. So without further ado, with the disclaimer, we're going to get to tonight's presentation. Jane and I have been doing this for over 3 years. It's really hard to believe that we've been doing this for over 3 years. Started out as the COVID-19 pandemic, and here we are. We just learned that the pandemic is over, according to a presidential proclamation. I don't know if it is or it isn't, but we are moving in a new era of the COVID-19 pandemic or lack of pandemic. But what hasn't changed are the issues and concerns affecting children with disabilities, their parents, school officials, teachers, administrators. So we're going to continue our journey tonight, even though we're out of the pandemic mode. Jane and I and others have been continuing to make presentations through our webinar. We are still part of a community of concerned individuals, parents, professionals, who are still learning how to connect with one another. And instead of navigating the COVID-19 pandemic, navigating the post-COVID-19 pandemic. And we have moderated a series of webinars. We will continue to moderate those webinars. We'll make an announcement at the end of tonight's webinar about our next one. And we have our topics for tonight, understanding, and I might add that all of you that have submitted questions, and we have over 2 pages of questions, we will do our level-headed best to get to all of them, but I can't promise we'll get to all of them, but we will get to most of them in the allotted time. And we'll be discussing basic rights in special education, parents' input and concerns, transitioning to the next school year, preparing for annual reviews. Some of this will be coming in through the question and answer format and our discussions, planning ahead. And if we don't get to everybody's questions or concerns this evening, we will be announcing another webinar next month where we can, quote, continue the conversation. So Jane, how you been? I haven't seen you at least a month. And anything new? And certainly you can introduce yourself, and Marla and Allie after Jane.
Hi, Lawrence. It's great to be back again. I can't believe either that it's been over 3 years since we've been doing these webinars. I'm the executive director of a program called JumpStart, which is at the Stamford JCC, and also we opened up a classroom in the Maritime Odyssey preschool located in Norwalk. The JumpStart program primarily supports children with developmental disabilities aged 2 to 3. And then I help those children transition into the public school. I also have my own advocacy business where I continue to advocate for children throughout the different grades and throughout school districts all over Fairfield County. I think one of the biggest challenges, even though the COVID pandemic is finished, we're still reeling from the after effects, one of which is a lack of resources, in particular personnel resources within districts. A lot of districts are feeling the after effects. They don't have enough physical therapists, occupational therapists, special education teachers, behavior therapists, paraprofessionals, and all of the above. And a lot of districts are now using that as an excuse as to why they are not providing the related services which have been agreed within an IEP, or children regrettably have not made as much progress as you would have hoped because they have been unable to receive the appropriate education that they deserve and every child should have. So even though the pandemic has officially ended, I don't think the effects of the pandemic have ended, and those ripples are going to be felt for many years to come for the children that we all support and advocate and take care of within Connecticut and beyond. So it's a pleasure to have Marla and Allie here tonight. I know there's lots of questions. It is silly season with IEPs and parents looking at their children's progress and with satisfaction or dissatisfaction and wanting to know how to take the next steps for the next school year or for extended school year in the summer. So without further ado, it's lovely to have you both here, Marla and Allie.
Good evening, everybody. I'll start. My name is Allie Grafman, and I am an advocate. I appreciate you participating tonight, and this is a return trip for me as well. I love this group, and it's just such a great feeling to be able to represent a lot of the questions that you have as an audience. I'll very briefly go over my background. I started off as a special education teacher and then went through administration, became a special ed administrator. And 9 years after I retired, or I should say 9 years since I retired, I'm in advocacy and I love what I do. I go into schools, I work with families and parents at PPTs and how to plan PPTs if they want to attend on their own. What Jane said is very true about the lack of resources, and I find that especially troublesome this year, and we may get into a little bit when we answer the questions, but what I feel I'm doing with parents for quite a few families would be to designate what services they need, regardless of the fact that they don't have the resources, because it's what the student needs, not what the district has. So I find myself advocating a lot for those resources, but glad that everybody's here tonight and look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Allie.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Marla Wayne, special education advocate. I've been advocating throughout Connecticut for around 10 years. I have two boys who are special education students. One is in a transition program and will need services for his entire life. And my other son is graduating high school. So we've just gone through and has an IEP. We've just gone through the progress of contacting the college he'll be going to and working on accommodations. So I look forward to this evening, and I've really enjoyed these seminars to date. Thank you for having me.
Just two housekeeping notes, and I see already some person anticipated. We ask that you put your questions in the Q&A format, not the chat, because this is being recorded and everything in the chat is part of the recording, whereas the Q&A is not. So whoever posted the question in the Q&A, thank you. We'll try to get to that question. It's an excellent question. And in the chat section, we've put our contact information. I hope it's obtainable. The last time, for some reason, we had a technical problem, but we supplied it after the webinar. There are some links to some resource guides, state websites, federal government websites. Those are partial answers to the question. For example, somebody is going to be we'll have a question on accessible playgrounds. There's a link to the Access Board on how a playground could be accessible. Others have asked about rights, so we've done our best to give that information in the chat room. So without further ado, and those two housekeeping notes, we look forward to a robust conversation and trying to get to questions and getting information out there where it can be, used best, and that's by families at PPT meetings here in Connecticut.
Well, I'm going to start off by, Larry, we had a question that came in before tonight And it's something parents quite often get confused about. What is the difference between mediation and due process? And what would your role be within those two functions?
The federal special ed law has built-in dispute resolution. So if there's an impasse reached at an IEP meeting, that's federal law, or PPT meeting under Connecticut law, parents have a right to file a request for a due process hearing, or they can go to voluntary mediation. Mediation is voluntary. It's with a third-party mediator. There's no record. There's no testimony. It's both sides trying to work towards the middle to try to resolve the dispute through a third-party mediator. A due process hearing is a formal administrative trial where a hearing officer, similar to an administrative law judge, will hear the testimony, review the evidence of both sides, and at the end of the process, issue a written decision. One side typically wins, one side typically loses. Occasionally, there's a split decision. So one is adversarial, one is contentious, one is trial-like, and the other is trying to explore that middle ground with a mediator. The State Department of Education has a mediation program. I myself tend to use private mediators on those occasions that I use mediation. So most of the time I file a request for a due process hearing, and we get another kind of settlement meeting called a resolution meeting. And the resolution meeting is similar to mediation, but there's no third-party mediator. The parties are negotiating directly with one another rather than through a third-party mediator.
One of the biggest differences as well is the cost. Isn't that right, Larry? That due process can actually end up being a very lengthy and costly exercise for some families in some instances versus mediation. Would that be true? In
some cases, yes. It depends. You know, it's definitely advisable to have an attorney at a due process hearing, because a school district will have their attorney representing the school district. Mediation, sometimes attorneys are there, sometimes they're not. It's less adversarial, and if it's less adversarial, it's less contentious. If it's less contentious, it should be less costly. So, you know, most of the time the answer is yes, but I have heard indirectly from clients of mine who have other attorneys, and they tell me how much the other attorney has charged for mediation, and sometimes I'm shocked. So it can be expensive. Most of the time it's not, at least with me, it's not. So.
That's great. So getting into another question that we received before tonight, I'm going to throw this out to Allie, but Marla, please chime in as well, and Larry too. If a family were wishing to get ABA therapy, how can a parent get ABA therapy in the public school system for their child?
Marla, do you want to begin, or do you want me to?
I thought she was throwing it out to you.
I thought both. Okay, I'll start. ABA therapy is a broad term, and I guess you really have to look at what specific ABA services you need for your child or for your student. Many schools have ABA therapists in the form, and the people that do that are typically school psychologists or BCBAs, the behavioral certified behavioral analyst will offer the ABA within the schools. If you feel that you need to go outside of what the school district has, that would require a PPT. And you would state all the reasons why the school would not be able to satisfy your students' needs, and weigh that against the outside provider who can, in your opinion, meet the students' needs. So basically, you would need a PPT to do that.
Yeah, just to jump in a little, you know, some districts have ABA programs set up. They have BCBAs, which are board certified behavior analysts, who oversee the programs, and behavior therapists or paras or registered behavior technicians who actually do the ABA therapy with the students. And there's different variations of ABA. You could be working on academic skills, life skills, behavioral skills. It's often easier to attain the service at a young age if you are autistic, and really that's the way that it's been said that you'll learn best through evaluations. But there are other ways to get it also. You can definitely, as I always talk about, is make sure you have explicit data. And if you show that your student or your child is not making gains, then you can use the request, or you can request ABA by showing the data and showing that gains are not being made. And if the district doesn't agree that the student requires ABA, you can get an outside evaluation, which potentially could recommend ABA. And then again, the district doesn't have to agree to everything that's recommended in an evaluation, but the combination of lack of progress and an evaluation could be helpful in attaining the services. And another thing in the state of Connecticut is there are a lot of agencies now that have their own spaces where they do ABA. So a lot of the younger students, preschool age and maybe into kindergarten, are accessing ABA services through private agencies outside of the school district, and they're covered by insurance because it is mandated in the state of Connecticut that certain amounts of ABA, depending on your needs and age, are accessible.
The other thing to note too, that ABA is a specific methodology, and those that administer ABA practices, there's certain certifications and level of training that they receive. So a paraprofessional, if they're working with a student that requires ABA, should probably be RBT trained, or at least have that level of certification. So even if you feel, oh, that's great, my child is going to receive ABA services, you need to be very careful as to who is providing that ABA training and who is overseeing the individual that is delivering that that training to, because really you should be overseen by a board certified behavior therapist. So pay attention to the detail. Some schools like CES do not have ABA methodology. So also be mindful, if you're looking at different schools, what are their methodologies? What are their philosophical practices? Because not all programs offer ABA. And just to caution parents, ABA has, comes with certain scientific data to support it as a tried and tested approach, but it's not always the silver bullet for every child. Every child might respond differently to ABA. So just don't always assume that ABA is going to have the biggest impact. It might not be right for your child, but pay attention to who's administering it, who's collecting the data, and how they're using that data. There's no point collecting it if it's not being used appropriately. Larry, do you have anything else to add about that?
No, but also because if you ask for an evaluation, it might be denied. If you ask for a service like ABA, it might be denied. You have to know your procedural safeguards, and there is a link. You should have those procedural safeguards at the time of a PPT meeting, before, during, or after. There's certainly a link to the procedural safeguards on the State Department of Education, and most local school districts have a resource page with the procedural safeguards. Those are your rights as parents. Those are your child's rights as a student. And we just touched upon the difference between due process hearing and mediation. That's part and parcel of the rights. Independent evaluations. I have a link to the State Department of Education guidance on independent evaluations, that you make a request for an independent evaluation that could end up with the school district requesting a due process hearing to defend their evaluation. So it's always advisable to know your rights. It's always advisable to understand what you're asking for, as was pointed out. And there is a question that was presented in the Q&A, and I apologize if we're speaking in acronyms. The four of us don't speak this way, but when you're dealing with school districts, you have to know what BCBA and PPT and RBT and all this other stuff, that so you can speak the language, read along, understand. And the person that asked, what is a PPT meeting? It's a pupil planning team meeting. It's called an IEP in the federal regulation. It's a meeting between parents, school officials, consultants, others, to discuss whether or not a child is a child with a disability, whether or not the child meets the eligibility criteria for special education, whether or not the child should have an IEP, another acronym, individual education plan, and whether the IEP is appropriate, that's as in legally appropriate. And when a PPT is needed is if you see your child struggling in school and your concerns are not being addressed by the teacher, the administrators, it's possible that you need to discuss this at a PPT meeting, what's called a referral to special education. In Connecticut, and this is one of our questions tonight, so I'll answer it. When a child, the school districts are required to make a prompt referral to a PPT meeting when a child's attendance, behavior, performance in school is unsatisfactory or at a marginal level of performance. So if your child is not performing well, if you have school refusal, you have meltdowns, you have behavioral issues, academic performance is not up to par, that's when you have a PPT meeting to discuss next steps. Do we need an evaluation? If we need an evaluation, the next step is, to return to the PPT to determine eligibility. If the child is eligible, we write the IEP and give the IEP a period of time to see if it's appropriate. And if you're starting to see the gaps close, it's appropriate. If you're not seeing the gaps close, then we go back to a PPT meeting to discuss next steps or get outside evaluations.
Thank you. And then this is a question for the advocates. In terms of advocacy work, as a parent, so we've had the question about acronyms. What do you recommend that parents should do that are beginning their journey as parent advocates? Marla, you've been a parent with a child with disabilities before you became an advocate. What got you onto this journey, and what advice would you give parents at the beginning of their advocacy journey as a parent?
Right. Well, at the beginning, I knew nothing, and it was many, many years ago, and I educated myself. I also hired an advocate, so I learned through the person that I hired, but then I educated myself, and I had gone through with my own son most of the things that we're talking about today, so through mediation, basically. So I had the experience, and then people started asking me for help. So I was helping people and then turned it into advocating as a business.
That's great.
Sure.
There's also an organization called the Council of Parent Advocates and Attorneys. COPA is the acronym for that. It's a tremendous organization. It is national, and they do have, you can find people within your local community too. They do offer some formal training for advocacy, Seat 1, Seat 2, and Seat 3. I myself took their Seat 2 training. I think it was over a 9-month period. You then have to do tutorage under an attorney. I did mine with Lawrence. And it's a great way to get you started on the path of advocacy. But I agree with Marla, and I'm sure Allie would also testify that to partner up with an advocate to help guide you and show the ropes is also a very good place to start. Just to help you understand some of the nuances and the expectation of what happens at meetings and evaluations, and how to understand the data that you're receiving would be my recommendation.
Those are excellent points, and particularly the knowledge part, knowing where the information is on state of Connecticut websites, the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education website. Sometimes there are private organizations such as COPA and other organizations that have information available. And that's the key, is being knowledgeable, having that information available. And the more the parents know, the better they can advocate for their child. It's just when sometimes we get into very contentious and difficult situations, that's where it's generally advisable to bring in an advocate or an attorney to help out in that situation.
So Ali, what do you suggest to a parent? We had a question. What if testing shows inconsistencies and the school districts decide they don't qualify for services? What advice would you have for those families?
Well, that happens quite frequently when the school does their own evaluation and whatever the criteria they're looking at, whether it's specific learning disabilities or autism, whatever they're looking at, they use a criteria sheet from the state of Connecticut, or they should be using one. And it is a consensus. It's not a vote. It's a consensus by the PPT as to their decision. So when it happens that the parents are disagreeing or the guardians are disagreeing with the school team, and the parents say that their child is eligible and the school team doesn't, my support would be in the area of, okay, what are the next steps? I think that you want to leave that meeting with an understanding that you can agree to disagree. You don't want to build barriers at that point, and you don't ever want to build barriers if you can help it, but you've got a long road to travel. So you can agree to disagree. And then after the meeting, think about next steps. What are your options? Often I work with clients and asking for an independent educational evaluation. And the anachronism for that is an IEE. And if the IEE request is certainly a whole different topic, but basically what you are saying when you request an IEE is that you are disagreeing with the district's evaluation. You can write a letter to the director of pupil services or whoever the administrator was at your child's PPT to request that independent educational evaluation. If it is granted, and then you have another expert in the area to evaluate your child, and then you come back to a PPT. Again, the PPT team has to review the evaluation. They don't necessarily have to accept it, but it really lays the foundation for specific evaluation data that you can use to look at eligibility again. So, that's one way that I go about it. Of course, there's always mediation and due process. You try to avoid that if you can through another evaluation. You can also go privately and have your own evaluation. You don't necessarily have to ask for an IEE, which the district would be financially responsible for. It's at public expense. But you as parents certainly have the opportunity to go privately and bring forth your private evaluation to the PPT. So there are several ways to go about it, but that's what I usually work with my families.
Mm-hmm.
On that.
We have a question that was posted in the Q&A. It's multi-part, but I'm just going to ask that we slice off one part of the question. This is a parent with a young child who has autism, concerned with progress. Are there any books or materials out there that you would recommend to educate of how a parent could educate themselves with respect to progress or the whole process of determining whether or not there's progress on a child's IEP?
I think it depends on the type of program that the child is receiving. But if for instance, the child is receiving ABA, then there are many books, but the most important thing is that they should have a program book. And in that book, there should be goals and objectives, and there should be data every time the student is receiving instruction or any kind of ABA help related to behavior. So through that, you would have specific data, and you would ask that data be graphed and analyzed. And that way you would know if the student is making progress with regard to ABA. If you're looking for another type of program, or if you're looking for information about IEPs and how to best measure goals and objectives, to be able to see if the student is making progress. Rights laws books are very helpful in multiple areas, and you can do a search on rights law, and attain additional information. But it really depends on what kind of program you're talking about.
I think it's also too, you have to see what the baseline is of that child's abilities, how old they are. Have you just come from a birth to 3 system? What evaluations and data was collected in birth to 3? Is there a huge disparity between your previous experience with other therapists versus how the child is engaging and connecting with educators in the public school? What are the barriers to the child making progress? Is it environmental? Is it due to inappropriate related services being offered, or a lack of related services being offered? Is it that the environment is too distracting for the student and we need to look at a smaller classroom with more heightened, enhanced staffing? So there's lots of reasons why a child might not be making progress when they transition at a young age. And so really, without seeing the nuances, it's hard to give that answer. And indeed, the goals and objectives that they're being benchmarked against might not be appropriate for that child either. They might not be bespoke enough to that child, or focus in the right areas for that child. So it's a hard question to answer without actually knowing the full details. I would steer parents away from Googling, because that can lead you down a rabbit hole and actually cause you more anxiety, because every child is unique, which is why we have an individual educational plan. So it's hard for us to give you more clarity without knowing the individual situation with the child. And that's where the beauty of an advocate like Allie, Marla, myself, or Lawrence is, because we can look at the individual information pertaining to that child and give you a sense as to what might be a more appropriate educational environment, as well as delivery of related services.
And those are excellent points. And that's why I myself am often not only guided by parents who I consider to be experts on their child, but people with PhDs and OT designations, PT, speech and language, LCSWs, psychiatrists, pediatricians, to help me understand the child's strengths and weaknesses, help the parents as well. And so often that's where the information is coming from me. There are books out there, but not necessarily a book, but often an evaluation report, parent concerns. I don't see this at home kind of concerns. There's no generalization of skills. So there's no one source of information. You can, spend all day on Google researching things, but sometimes it's best to talk to, often pediatricians, especially a developmental pediatrician, are often a very good starting point, and they could steer a parent in the right direction for resources, evaluation. Sometimes the teaching hospitals like Yale or UConn are good sources of information here in Connecticut.
Marla, there was also another question. It relates to data, which is obviously a common trend in our conversations. What should a parent do when data is not being recorded and/or correct progress reporting is not being done? And Allie, feel free as well to add on to Marla's conversation.
Yes, so if you're not receiving data, or the data seems incorrect, I would definitely ask for a PPT. And then I would request that you receive the data for specific intervals. So whether that be weekly, monthly, bi-monthly, et cetera, you want to receive the data more often than you're going to receive a progress report, which is 3 or 4 times a year. So there's a progress monitoring section on the new IEP, and you want to make sure that it says either weekly, monthly, bi-weekly, et cetera. And then you want to make sure that you know on the IEP that the parent is going to receive that information, however often the PPT team agrees to. It's really important that that also be added in, because I don't know how consistently the data is taken, or if it's set up in user-friendly form if the team doesn't realize that the parent is going to request this information. And if you think it's not correct, it could go one or two ways. You could ask how they're taking the data. If you're thinking they're just doing the frequency of a behavior, but they're not giving the duration, you can ask for them to do that. If there's a teacher taking the data and they're busy because they have other students, you can say, can a BCBA, again, that's a board certified behavior analyst, be involved as a consult or direct with my child to help come up with the best way to take data so that you're comfortable with what you're receiving, so that the data is analyzed and reviewed and the plan is updated, or the goals and objectives are updated appropriately based on how the child is doing.
Just a brief add-on to that, Marla. PPTs generally speak about how great your child is doing. Okay, I haven't been to a PPT yet that says to begin and says, oh yeah, well, we're in trouble. Most of the time, all the staff members say, oh yeah, they're showing, your child is showing progress. Progress is nebulous. What is progress? It's a very general term. So that's why it's hard to measure data, because it's so ambiguous. The way I look at the IEP not only is a legal document, but it is also a format. It is the foundation to your child's program. We need to really carve those IEP objectives so systematically that they are measurable. They have to be measurable with, as Jane mentioned, with baseline data. In other words, if your child is supposed to achieve 80% accuracy in reading short vowel sounds, whatever, what is your child doing now? Your child may be doing 75% already. And then they spend a whole IEP year doing the same objective over and over again when your child is very close to already achieving that. So the data is very, very important. You need to have it specified and measurable. And then, as Marla mentioned, the progress monitoring. When I am at a PPT, I always include on the recommendations how the progress monitoring will occur and what assessments will be given. So some progress monitoring can be done weekly, data, points. Others have to be done in longer spans of time. But it should be well understood by both the team and the parents, what is the progress monitoring going to involve and the frequency of the progress monitoring. So that together with your objectives, you should really have a good handle on your child's progress.
And just one more thing that I've mentioned at the last two meetings is the evaluation method. Right now on the IEP, it's automatically showing progress towards short-term objectives for the way that the objectives are measured. But I ask at every PPT that the other box be checked and that the pre and post baseline data is written into that area. Some districts like to put it in the objective, whether it's in the objective or the evaluation method on the IEP. It's really important because as everyone keeps saying, if you don't have that baseline data, you don't know where you're starting and you don't really know if your student is making progress.
Yeah, and this time of year, the baseline data is so fundamental because you want to be able to show how your child ended a grade. You want to then be able to, when you also then want similar evaluations done at the beginning of the school year so that you can see, has there been regression over the summer? Has the ESY program been robust enough? Did your child qualify for ESY? If not, and you see that there's a decline, then that bolsters your argument for the following year. So the end of year data and then making sure that you collect that baseline data at the beginning of the following school year is also really fundamental, because without that, you can't track a child's progress sufficiently enough. And also then tailor the goals and objectives to meet your child, where they are at. So just keep an eye on it at this time of year and then follow through at the beginning of next year as well. But that being said, in terms of the new, everybody's feeling overwhelmed with IEPs, and particularly with the new CT-SED system. We did have a question in before tonight. And Allie, I'm going to address this to you because you have been an educating teacher yourself in a previous life. One of the questions that came in is teachers are overwhelmed with CT sets, is taking time away from the children. How do we address time for instruction?
Well, if your child has an IEP, it is specified, all of the specialized services that your child has is in the IEP. So if you are concerned that your child is not getting the specialized services, when I say specialized services, I mean special education services, occupational therapy services, speech and language, physical therapy, whatever social work services, whatever they are, it's identified and prescribed in the IEP. I have, worked with families in making sure that the services are accountable for. You could ask a service provider to give you a log of service time. And if the log shows that your child isn't getting what is designated on the IEP, you are, or your child is entitled to regain those services. So it's compensatory time. It could be a minimal of an hour, or it could be days, or even worked with the family just recently. They didn't realize the child wasn't getting speech and language services for months. That's compensation time. So yes, the new IEP, the Connecticut says, the CT says it's taken away instructional time, but a child with an IEP has those rights. They have the endorsement of the specialized time. If you have a child in typical regular education class and you feel that instruction is being taken away, I would talk with the providers first and talk with the teacher and tell them your concerns. If you feel that it is not being addressed correctly, then you go to the administrator. So you go up the channels. But certainly there are people to talk with, and the Board of Ed is a great sounding board. If that's where you have to go, that's what you need. But you would want to make sure that you have data to back up the time, the fact that your child's instruction is being compromised because of time elsewhere with the IEP.
I think service logs are fantastic. I use them all the time. And service logs is not only clocking the number of minutes, because it's not necessarily has a session being complete, how many minutes of that 30x times a week have actually been worked on, who has done the who has carried out that related service. Has it been the appropriately certified, trained individual to do the speech or the behavior, whatever it might be? And also you can also specify what goals and objectives were worked on during that session as well. So you can really home in and track why maybe progress wasn't made because they didn't work on those specific goals for an extended period of time. So the service logs can be a really good tool, and you can request more detail on those service logs than merely did they have speech that week or that particular day.
We had a couple of questions that I'm going to conflate into one answer about procedural safeguards. We had one school administrator asking a question: how do I make sure my students or their families understand their rights? As I mentioned before, there are procedural safeguards that the State Department of Education has on their website. These are often provided to parents prior, during, or after a PPT meeting. There are other publications, such as the Parent's Guide to Special Education, which is published by the State Department of Education, which is also available on the State Department of Education website. ct.gov is the state website. Click on letter E for education. And these are ways to ensure that parents and their children understand what their rights are. There's another area, and that is increasingly making sure that the published materials are usable and accessible to parents who may have sensory issues. They may not read English. And we had Brian Klimowitz on our webinar last year, who's the Bureau Chief for Special Education Services at the State Department of Education. And I forget the number, but I think there was approximately 12 languages that the materials are being translated into on the CTSEDS website. I haven't followed up and counted because I'm dealing with English and Spanish, but not other languages. But I know Brian Klimowitz had offered to make sure that more materials were available. And I think, was it you, Jane, that said there are, 92 dialects in Stamford or something?
Yeah, I think it's, and some of, I think some of our cities, Bridgeport, Norwalk, Stamford, they're much more diverse. And I'd read an article, there were 92 languages spoken in some of those communities. And when I've been at PPT meetings, they've been unable to find translators of this particular dialect. They just weren't able to find it, but it is the parents' fight to have somebody there to translate on their behalf. Technology is a wonderful thing, but it doesn't replace the of having a person in front of you that's able to help translate the nuances versus just using a Google app on your phone.
Good point.
We had a lot of questions. We had a couple of questions. I'm going to throw this out to anybody that wants to answer. Do private schools have to offer services to children with ASD? And a related one is, how are special education services delivered in a charter or a private school setting?
Well, when a parent or family chooses a private school, and you have a child with ASD, you usually look for a private outplacement that specializes in the autism spectrum. So do private schools have to service a student with ASD? They have to service the student, but they also are private, so they have specific criteria on who they will be accepting as far as their enrollment. So they don't have to accept your child if they feel that they cannot service them. So that's kind of the general rule. But in all, when you're looking for a school for a student with autism, you go to an autism specific school, unless your child is high functioning autism and you feel you need a more broad program. And then there are private schools for that too. But the schools, at least the ones that I've dealt with here in Connecticut, and even outside of Connecticut, do a pretty good job in reviewing the file, interviewing the family, and having the student shadow. And if they feel, shadow meaning visiting the school and participating in the school, if they feel that they cannot service your child adequately, they should be telling you that up front. But private schools have their own regulations, and they have their enrollment policy that is certainly theirs to be able to put forward and to authorize. So there are many schools in Connecticut and many fine schools that service students with autism.
And I would add that the State Department of Education has a list of approved private special ed schools. And there was a question, do we have the best school recommendation for a child who's considered high functioning with autism? And I don't think it's a fair question for us because we don't have enough information, but there are resources out there, such as the State Department of Education list of approved schools, and you can check out that list, and there's usually a one-page summary. This school is for children with behavioral problems. This one is for students with learning disabilities. This school is for a child with autism. Bingo, that's the one you want to check out. And so I don't think we have a recommendation for the best school, but there are schools out there, as Allie pointed out.
I would say though, just because a school is on a list that it's a state approved school, that does not mean that it's necessarily of the best quality. It's very important you do your own research. you can do your own, in this case, it might be worth Googling a school and see if they've made the headlines in any regard or any way. So just because the school is on a state approved list, that's not necessarily meaning it's going to be the right fit for your child, or indeed the level of education is of a superior nature to schools that are not on that state approved list. So please do your individual research on all the schools that you feel might be a good fit for your child. Don't assume that because they are on a list that they supersede others that don't make that list. There's just do your research.
That's important. There are schools that are on the list. There are schools that are not on the list, and that's an excellent point. This time of year, as we're moving towards the end of the school year, some parents are looking at ESY, another acronym, Extended School Year Services, and some parents are looking at summer programs, camps, things like that. Do you have any sage advice on ESY or looking at summer camps for this upcoming summer?
I think what's happening this summer, so we have a summer camp at the JCC called Hand in Hand, which regrettably is full at this stage. We do one-on-one and we do 2-to-1 instruction for children 3 through to 9th grade. But the problem that some of the funding is, so DSS and DDS were at one point providing funding for camp programs. However, that might be changing if parents are choosing to turn down an ESY program and instead choose to put their child in a private camp. They might not have access to the same resources they have done previously. So just be mindful, if you're turning down ESY, just make sure that you have the means by which to fund that summer camp program for that child, because things have been done differently this past year with regard to state funding.
Well, there are also situations where the district will pay for the camp in lieu of ESY because the child really requires a full day and longer than 4.5 weeks of ESY per school year or per the summer. So
sometimes it's socialization opportunities that are available that aren't available in ESY. So that's a good point. And that sort of dovetails with one of the questions we had about accessible playgrounds. The federal law since 1973, Section 504, requires academic and non-academic parts of a school to be accessible and usable for children with disabilities. And since 1973, we passed another law called the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that was passed in 1990. And the Americans with Disabilities Act has actual standards, and I have put in the chat the Access Board, which is a federal agency that has developed standards as to how to make not only playgrounds, but other areas of recreation, gyms, bathrooms, water fountains, you name it, any part of a school building to be accessible and usable for children with disabilities. So if the playground is existing, meaning it's very old and it hasn't been renovated, then it probably doesn't have to be accessible. But since most playgrounds, because of wear and tear, have been modified, replaced, or repaired since at least 1990, the federal laws apply. And I have myself been involved with several cases way back when, in the early days of the Americans with Disabilities Act, where I filed what are called OCR, Office of Civil Rights Complaints, with the United States Department of Education against parks and recreation or schools which are recipients of federal funding under 504, Section 504, and they're places of public accommodations, public facilities, under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that's another set of laws, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, in addition to the special ed laws that are a source of rights when we're dealing with access issues like accessible playgrounds or bathrooms that are not accessible or front doors that are not accessible or stairs and barriers that keep individuals with disabilities out of the building, or they have to go to a less desirable location, like the loading dock in the rear of the school, as opposed to walking through the front door, which doesn't open because it's not an electronic door, or there's a barrier like stairs, and there's no ramp. So these are things that parents should also be looking at, not only the IEP, but if your child has sensory issues, physical limitations, how to make that school building, the playground, parks and recreation accessible and usable for any individual with disabilities.
I'd just quickly like to make a plug. So in addition to being the executive director for JumpStart, I actually work for the Susan McGraw Foundation, and I look for community partners, one of which is Mill River Park in Stamford. And the foundation has donated a substantial amount of money to renovate the playground at Mill River Park to make it accessible. And I can tell you that going into the design of that, and I was part of the conversation and looking at what elements we would wish to have, a lot of thought and consideration goes into developing an accessible playground. There's also other organizations we partner with. Maritime Aquarium Museum is one, and there's 11 organizations in Fairfield County who have status of being accessible and provide programming geared to people that learn in different ways or have a variety of different needs and disabilities. So you can actually find the website is Accessibility for All, might give you some options of locations, parks, or programming within the Fairfield or greater Connecticut area that are more accessible than others. Unfortunately, you do have to look for these things, but there are some around.
There used to be a publication years ago, I forget the name of the doctor, that would put out every couple of years, Accessible Connecticut. Unfortunately, that book is out of print. And my own daughter has put some of these recreational opportunities, plays, restaurants, others on our website. It's what, Facebook or, yeah, Facebook. Okay. I'm not a tech person. She's sitting to my right. So we try to get information out, on Broadway plays that are sensory friendly or something that's unusual as it comes across our desk. We try to get that information out to whoever is looking at our Facebook.
Just to remind parents, though, within your own district, you can ask for an accessibility evaluation or assessment. It's called an accessibility assessment. Usually the physical therapist, the PT, or the OT, or both, occupational therapy or physical therapist, will do an accessibility assessment in your playground or even within the school environment. They look at everything. Safety is usually a major concern. So you can definitely rely on the school. Most schools, you would have to get that authorized through a PPT, but you may just be able to ask for informally and granted, especially at this time of year when it's crunch time and people are loaded with PPTs. But definitely check out your school, and an assessment may be the key to get what you need, because if the assessment shows that there are areas or equipment that is unsafe or and not accessible for your child, then they are bound by law to make remediations.
We had a couple of questions come in for the older student on transition planning. And by older student, I mean a student who's at least 14 years of age, probably at the end of middle school, beginning high school. The federal law requires transition planning for students to be prepared for life after high school in the area of furthering their education, becoming competitively employed, and if necessary, learning how to live independently. And in Connecticut, we have, and I have a link to it in the chat, it's called the Transition Bill of Rights. You should be getting the Transition Bill of Rights starting at age 14. And the Transition Bill of Rights also dovetails with another document called the CORE, C-O-R-E, Transition Guidelines, which are also published by the State Department of Education, that both documents create an expectation on the part of the General Assembly, the State Department of Education, and most important, parents and society, that we have children go through high school and come out on the other side ready for college, if that's where they're going. They have the skills they need to become competitively employed, and they have skills that, if needed, to live independently. And one of the questions that we had in Connecticut, a student with a disability with an IEP is eligible through their 22nd birthday for special education. There's a law, I don't know if it's passed or not, that was proposed to have it, the eligibility go through the school year that the student turns 22. I know I submitted testimony of that. I don't know if that's passed or not. And the question was, if my child leaves a post-secondary program prior to age 22, does the school district have any obligations? The answer is no. The school has no obligation if a student graduates high school with a regular education high school diploma, or they age out of special education at age 22, or they just leave the program after age 18, but before age 22. So it's very important that students who are now 18 are considered legally an adult, that they know their rights, not only the parents, and they can authorize their parents to be their educational advocate with a piece of paper saying, I'm authorizing mom and dad to advocate for me with the school district, and I want them to make decisions on my behalf. Or it could be a power of attorney, or it could be a legal guardianship or a conservatorship, which is obtained through the probate court that serves your town. There's no one answer on, I always start with the least intrusive form of documentation, such as a student authorizing his or her parents to be their educational advocate, so they can retain me, so they can make decisions on behalf of their now soon to be young adult, post-age 18 young adult going off into the world. So it's important that you understand the rights, understand what the transition bill of rights are, what the expectations are with a core transitions guide put out by the State Department of Education.
Another question we received, I know we're coming to the end of the evening, but this has been quite prolific in most PPT meetings I've been to. A common theme is, what's the correct response when the school says we don't have the ability to do that, or we just don't have the funding for that, or we don't have the staff for that? It's coming up quite a lot at the moment. Allie, Marla, and Lawrence, any comments?
If it's something that the student requires to be successful under IDA, and to have his special education program or her special education program be appropriate, then they have to do it. And I don't know what they're referring to. If it's something that the district is not responsible for, then that's not the case. But if you're talking about a related service that the student requires based on testing and ability, then they have to do that.
And the corollary to that, or the addition to that, is if the school can't do it and the parents can find a private provider, make a proposal to the school district. Let's say it's speech and language or occupational therapy. I found a private OT or speech and language provider. Will you pay or reimburse us for the cost because you don't have one on staff? So the out-of-box thinking that became epidemic during the pandemic is still prevalent today, because we are all we're still seeing the ravages of COVID-19, not the virus itself, but there are staffing shortages. I drive on I-95 through Bridgeport, and it's Norwalk and Bridgeport public schools have taken out billboards on I-95 to try to get staff to hire staff for their school district. I've never, it's not some product or some personal injury lawyer, it's the school districts that are now taking out billboard ads on the interstate to find staff, because they just can't find people or enough people to work in the districts. And these are, and that's going to back up on our children with IEPs. So the more out-of-box thinking you have, the more creativity. If you contain the services privately, I think it's better for the child.
there's also contracted services that districts can rely on, you know, that don't necessarily require you as a parent finding a resource person, but the school district has connections to agencies that you can contract services in most, if not all, of the related services like speech and language, OT, PT, and so forth. So it's not what they have, it's what your child needs and what is required. That's, you know, that's the short way of answering it. You may want to be a little bit more polite out of PPT, but certainly your child, if your child has a need, then the district is required to provide for that need.
And that feeds into free, appropriate public education, what's appropriate, not what's available, but what's appropriate for your child's needs in order to make meaningful educational progress. And these are concepts that Congress tossed around in 1975 when they passed this law. It's been interpreted by 3 or 4 or 5 United States Supreme Court decisions as to what appropriate means in free, appropriate public education. And again, knowing your rights, knowing how to analyze data, knowing how to request data, not being shy at these PPT meetings when you're in a meeting of 10, 12 people and you're there alone, you know, parents are an equal member of the team. And PPTs, as we pointed out, are supposed to consider the parents' input and concerns for enhancing their child's education. They're supposed to consider outside evaluation reports. And the question is, what does consider mean? Sometimes consider means it goes in one ear and out the other. And sometimes it means it stops in the middle of both ears, and meaning it's processed by the brain. And there's no one answer. There's no one size fits all answer. We're dealing with people. We're dealing with school districts. Some school districts are better resourced than others. Some people are more caring than others. Some are not. So it's important that parents know their rights, parents understand their child, understand the data that they're receiving or ask for the data they're not receiving. So they're able to measure progress, do a trend analysis. This is where my child was 3 years ago. This is where that child is today. And see if the gaps are closing. Because I always, you know, tell parents, you know, you're the best, you know, advocate for your child. You are the expert on your child. You see your child every single day in multiple settings, not just in a school setting. And if something is happening at school, you should be able to see it at home. And if there's no generalization of skills, that's a question, not an accusation. Why don't we see it at home? So I know we're getting close to a concluding hour, so I don't know if there are any last questions. I apologize for those who posted questions or presented questions that we didn't have a chance to get to. So Jane, are there any other questions or topics you want to touch
We've
on?
had so many questions tonight. We haven't got through them all, but we are going to be doing another roundtable on June the 7th, where we're going to invite Marla and Allie back to continue the conversation, continue the dialogue. There was one quick question which said, is there a specific amount of hours schooling services that a child with special needs is entitled to receive at preschool? The answer is no, it depends upon the child's individual needs. But what I will say, transitioning children into different preschools throughout Fairfield and beyond, some school districts offer more hours per week than other districts. Some districts may offer 2.5 hours with no typical peers involved in that classroom. Other students might receive 5 hours, 5 days a week within the same district. Other districts offer a much longer school day for all children. So it really depends upon not only what your individual child needs, but also, regrettably, sometimes it does depend upon where you actually live and the school district that you're residing in with regard to the length of the school day for preschool setting. I hope that answers that question.
It's also helpful to advocate if you're looking for more hours, because sometimes it's not offered, but then when you ask for it, it is a possibility.
Yeah.
And somebody had asked if we have our contact information in the chat, and this should be available in a recording afterwards. I have my contact, Marla has her contact, Jane, and Allie. These are our phone numbers, websites, etc. So if it's not there, it will be there. We had a technical problem at the last webinar, so we'll make sure our contact information is getting to people. I want to thank our guests, Marla and Allie. I also want to thank my daughter who puts all this together and is your contact in getting us the questions, registering, logging in, dealing with all the technical issues that are make these webinars available. Jane and I have been doing this for the past 3 years. As Jane pointed out, we will have another webinar on June 7th at 7 o'clock with the same guests, and we will continue to get your questions, try to answer them as best we can. And I want to thank Marla and Allie for their time this evening, and of course Jane being the co-host of our webinars for seems forever. So I hope everybody will be safe and healthy by June 7th, and we'll survive this onslaught of PPT meetings. I don't know about you, but I'm doing 2 or 3 a day this time of year. Not that I'm complaining, but it is bunching up at the end of the year. So Jane and I will keep a watchful eye on special education issues and discuss anything between now and the next meeting. Just a note, there is a piece of legislation called CASA, K-A-S-A, that our Senator Chris Murphy down in Washington is sponsoring that will help people with children in special education. Please contact his office in Hartford or in Washington if you want to know more about the CASA legislation and support the legislation. He's been a very good proponent on the Senate's Health Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pension for students with disabilities, not only here in Connecticut, but around the nation. So those are my concluding remarks, and I hope Jane and Marla and Allie will have their concluding remarks as well. Thank you.
I'd just like to thank everybody for tonight and for you sending us the questions. They're very helpful, hopefully not only for yourself, but for others that might be watching. I just recommend that please don't sit there and don't leave it too long before you reach out for help from someone like myself, Allie or Marla. The sooner you get the support and you get your child the appropriate services they need, and we make sure that the goals and objectives are on track at the end of this year, ready for next year. And the more comfortable you can feel going into the following school grade, and you can hopefully relax and enjoy your summertime a little more easily. So don't be afraid to reach out to Marla, Allie, myself, Florence, or others that do this work in the field as well. If you need it, ask for the help.
I just want to ditto the thank you. Thank you for participating tonight. It is the time of year. I know everybody's feeling it. So for our panel, thank you. Thank you for inviting us. Rachel, thank you for all your background work. We wouldn't be here without you. And navigating, just as as a closing remark, navigating the school system is tough for me, and I've been in it for all my adult years, beyond that. So it takes a lot of thought and a lot of hard work and time. And don't beat yourself up about it. If you feel like you need the support outside of you and your family, seek out support as needed. But thank you everybody for coming.
Yes, thank you for joining us, everyone. Thank you for everyone on the panel, or to everyone on the panel. We look forward to continuing the conversation on June 7th. And I wish everyone great luck with the end of the year meetings. Thank you.
So we will see everybody again on June 7th. And thank you again for everybody who's staying with us throughout the evening as well. Good night.